We're going to be starting our first lecture off with a brief introduction to microbiology. So, the first question we want to answer, what is microbiology? This is the class you're taking. The textbook definition, which will vary from source to source, is something like the study of living things too small to be seen without magnification. So you have life, biology, the study of life, and then micro, the study of small life. So that's kind of a rough definition. These quote-unquote things we often refer to as microbes or microorganisms. And I assume most of you are familiar with that term. So we're going to be breaking that down pretty much throughout the entire semester, with more of the emphasis being in the first unit on what the nature of these things are. So many different types, and we'll go into that a little bit more here in a couple slides. So that's kind of the broad definition of the microbiology term, the study of small living things. Now, one of the reasons why microbiology is important is that microorganisms are nearly ubiquitous. So you want to be familiar with this term, ubiquitous. So what does that actually mean? Ubiquitous, in simple terms, means that something is found everywhere. So you can go ahead and write that down. Ubiquitous essentially means found everywhere. Now, if you look that up, you might find a more elaborate term. But found everywhere, and because most things aren't found everywhere, that's a term that you don't hear very often. So not many things can really be classified as ubiquitous. So microorganisms are very small and they're found everywhere. So that means that we don't typically see them, but yet they are found everywhere we go with very few exceptions. So that ultimately gives a certain sense of importance or priority, because no matter where you go, you'll come in contact with them in some variety. Usually you're unaware, but you'll almost always come in contact with them. So when we think about more on the impact of this ubiquity, there's at least two different ways to emphasize this importance of ubiquity. The first I'll take is an environmental standpoint, maybe less important for a lot of the emphasis in this class, but microbes have a major role in decomposing living and non-living organisms, or even you might just say organic matter. So bacteria and fungi play the biggest role in terms of microorganisms. There are certainly many other organisms that may not be classified as microbes that play this role. But in this capacity, they're often referred to as saprobes. You'll see that term come up again later. And saprobes are essentially just decomposers. It's more of a fancy word for a decomposer. So they ultimately break down living matter in order to obtain energy and resources. And in a role, as part of a role in that, they release that nutrient base back into the environment. So in feeding, they ultimately play a role in recycling nutrients. It's a very often unappreciated part of nature. We all know that if an organism dies in nature, that its body will decompose, but that process is not done without, at least in part, the role of microorganisms. Probably the more important emphasis in a class like this, with most of you presumably going into some kind of medical field, has to do with contamination. And so microbes are ultimately going to be present everywhere, ubiquitous. So that means that they become contaminants. So essentially nothing on Earth is sterile. It'd be hard-pressed to find a single example of something that hasn't been intentionally sterilized that would be sterile on its own. So you'd have to make that point to eliminate them. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the lab for those of you in the lab. So you have to specifically eliminate them from medical devices. This also plays a big role in food preservation. You know, we often don't think about this, but it's pretty much the main reason why you refrigerate and or freeze things, because it maintains the food preservation, obviously. But the reason why that works is because in the refrigerator you slow down microbial growth, so that essentially the decomposition process either crawls to a halt or just slows way down. And in a freezer it typically stops until it's unfrozen. And this also applies to things like infection and disease. So obviously if you have a wound and you don't do anything to clean it out, it's likely to become infected. Now, it may not become catastrophically infected. Your body can fight that off, but you'll have a much harder time getting a clean wound if you don't do anything to remove the microbes from it. So those are some of the big impacts of ubiquity. the role of decomposition writ large, and the role of contamination, especially in the medical world. So real quick, a couple of broad examples of the types of microorganisms we'll be studying in no particular order. Viruses are the most common out of all. We'll have a whole chapter on those at the end of this unit. So these are the biggest impact on humans. Bacteria, second on the list, have a pretty significant impact on humans, and often when we have bacterial infection, they're usually more harmful depending on the exact type of infection. Less impactful to humans are things like fungi and protists, but depending on where in the world and the nature, could still have a significant impact. Fungi tend to play their biggest role as part of the decomposition process, and protists are not as impactful here in North America, but do play a big role in health and disease around the world, especially near the equator. For example, malaria is a protist disease, and malaria infects many, many people around the world, although typically not in North America. So those are just some examples, and we will go into each of those, especially viruses and bacteria, in more detail. In fact, the next chapter will actually start with bacteria. Now, one of the things I want to talk about is germs, the term germ. Microbes are often described as germs, quote unquote. And the question here is, why is this term inaccurate when making a description about microbes? So most people don't think about microbes very often. And when they do, they usually have a tendency to associate a negative context with them. And that's what we think of as a germ. So germs tend to be described as harmful microorganisms. But the reason why that's inaccurate, and you want to just write this down in your own words here, the reason why that's inaccurate is that most microbes are not harmful. In fact, the majority of them are either neutral, meaning neither good nor bad, and many are actually beneficial. And I actually have an article this week in your class, depending on which class you're in, I may have one or two, that go into some of the subtle impacts that microbes can have, both good and bad. So they can affect everything from the health of your gut, the health of your gums in your mouth, for example, and many different downstream effects from the effects therein. So our gut microbiome will be something I emphasize throughout the semester, and many of the bacteria in our gut are actually beneficial. They play key roles in our health and even regulating our immune system. So to summarize, it's not accurate because you're categorizing everything as harmful when you use that term, when in fact only really a small percentage of microbes are actually harmful. What that percentage is hard to really say, but if you had to put a number on it, it's probably about 5%. Don't quote me on that, but roughly probably 5%, give or take, of all the microbes out there are truly considered a quote-unquote germ. So that's why that term is typically not accurate. Most are good, or at least neutral. Last thing, and we'll summarize, we'll wrap this video up. This will be relatively short. When we look at the field of microbiology, it's actually very dynamic. There's lots of different things going on. It may be one of the broader fields. So the different areas of emphasis can kind of be all over the place. So with this class, most of the students tend to be going into nursing or some aspect of the medical field, so we tend to focus on medical microbiology with more emphasis. That also includes at times the study of public health and epidemiology. So how are these microbes affecting people's health? And then epidemiology has more to do with the study of how microbes are spread. So the transmission rates and kind of how likely is something to spread, or what's the impact upon spread. Getting in a little bit more specifically, the last unit of this semester will largely focus around immunology, the way that our body is equipped to fight microbes and to even deal with them in a symbiotic nature, meaning that when I say that gut bacteria are good, our body tends to select for good microbes and maintain them and eliminate harmful microbes, for example. So immunology is kind of the study of how our body interacts in both good and bad ways with these microbes. So that'll be an emphasis at the end of the semester. Now, less of an emphasis for this class, but still important in the broader sense, would be industrial microbiology, and finally agricultural microbiology. But industrial microbiology looks at how microbes can be used in a commercial industry. Everything these days from genetic engineering, using microbes in sophisticated lab techniques, or it could just be using yeast, which is a microorganism, to brew beer or bread or wine or cheese. All those things kind of overlap within that sort of an industry context. And then with agriculture, you're looking at how do microbes affect crop development, both in good and bad ways. So microbes are needed for good soil quality, and at the same time microbes can be plant pathogens that cause disease. So like most things, we have good and bad, and so agricultural microbiology focuses on those. So that's it for this first video. Most videos won't be this short. This is just a real quick introduction, and you'll have one more video this week in the part 2. So I'll go ahead and stop it there. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me, and I will get back to you as quick as I can.